So, kind of change of format, because rather than me just pushing onto you the things I want to talk about, Ask Kev is about answering your questions. So I've had a couple of good questions come through. In the meantime, during the course of this 45 minutes, I'm trying to keep it to 45 minutes. If you've got any questions, just send them through and I'll do my best to answer them. But I have kind of prepared a little bit for the two questions I've got. And I've got questions from Pauline Easton, all the way from Croydon. And another one from Giselle, who can't be here tonight, so she wants to watch the recording, which is fine because Facebook records them automatically. But there's a couple of people who want to watch this but aren't on Facebook, so I'm making my own recording and that'll go onto YouTube or it might go onto Vimeo. We'll see. Now, there's my questions over there. There's my questions. That just makes my space so I can read them. Yeah, good numbers already. Well done. So we're going to kick off, and the first one's from Pauline Easton. Hi Pauline, hope you're doing well. Hope the sun's shining. Oh, there's a good one. I'm going to just make a note of that. Chris, that's a really loaded question. Chris has said, let me just see what Chris has said. He said, what filters would I recommend for landscape? All right, Chris, we'll come back to you in a little while and see whether I can help you with some of that. Listen, if I forget, if I get so kind of hooked up in the other ones and I forget to answer your question, Chris, prompt me. Yeah, just send another message. Hi, Pauline. Good. Okay, so Pauline's question was this. She said, I've noticed that when I take photos on my Fuji cameras, on my Fuji cameras, doesn't matter which, so she's got more than one. In low light indoors, I sometimes get these horizontal bands across the picture, and no amount of altering the shutter speed, etc., seems to make a difference. Is this something to do with the lighting? Well, the answer is yes and no. Those who've been on my masterclass will know the answer to this one. Let's just look at what's going on. So I'm going to let's just change screen. Let's have a look at that. Right, the thing is, Pauline, you've got a Fuji, and like a lot of mirrorless cameras, you can choose to shoot with a traditional mechanical shutter of the type that is in most DSLRs. It's the thing that makes the noise when you press the button on your camera. When you here's a DSLR. Let's just put this onto manual focusing. So okay, let's try this. That's a really slow shutter speed. Let's put it into manual and pick a fast one so you can hear it nice and quick. Okay, so much of that noise is created by the mirror mechanism, but some of it is created by the mechanical shutter. In a Fuji, and increasingly now, most if not all mirrorless cameras, and now some DSLRs are putting it in, is a different type of shutter called an electronic shutter. Now, you only really get electronic shutters in DSLRs when you're shooting in live view, which means you're shooting using the back screen rather than looking through the viewfinder. Live view on a Sony, I believe, is something else completely different, which confuses some people. Live view on just about every other maker camera means the ability to compose the shot by looking on the back screen. So you're composing from a digital image rather than looking through the eyepiece of the camera and seeing an image through the glass and lenses and mirrors and so on. Anyway, let's get back to the mirrorless camera. Let's get back to the Fuji, and let's get back to an electronic shutter and the difference between that and a mechanical one. A mechanical one really consists of two parts. They're called curtains, a first curtain and a second curtain. And when you take a picture, the first curtain moves out of the way and exposes the image, and then the second curtain comes down and closes the exposure, and the picture's taken. And that's how the sensor gets exposed to the image. First by one curtain dropping down, the sensor being exposed, and then the second one coming down to close the exposure, and then they reset. An electronic shutter is very different. It is electronic, and let me try and explain. Here's Here's, and it's not working. I love it when it doesn't work. I know why it doesn't work, because I've pressed that button there. There's a Fuji, and when you take the lens off of a Fuji, there's no kind of mechanism hiding the sensor. As you look into the opening here, and you can see just here, this is the sensor. Now on some cameras, some manufacturers are now starting to put in an automatic iris kind of shutter in, that when you remove your lens, it comes down and covers this opening to prevent dust going in and hitting straight onto the sensor. But this is a mirrorless camera. Basically take the lens off and there's the sensor. Now, hi David, hi Simon, hi Paul. Now, the main difference, and it is a massive difference between an electronic shutter and a mechanical shutter, is that the electronic shutter consists of lines, and what happens is one line is switched on, and then the next one, and then the next one, and then the next one, a bit like a TV scanning the image all the way down. And so if you look at the image here on the left, this is what's going to happen. As soon as I press my button, you're going to see an animation. You're going to see one line of the image being scanned, and then the next one, and then the next one. And on your sensor, one line is being switched on, one line at a time, until it gets to the bottom. On a mechanical shutter, it all happens pretty instantaneously. So if I hit the button, you'll see a difference. So let's just look at the mechanical. First of all, mechanical, you take a picture and boom, the whole image is exposed in one go. Boom, boom, boom. Yeah, just like that. On electronic shutter, it's one line at a time. Now, obviously, it's one line at a time very, very quickly, but nevertheless, it is one line at a time. And it's incredibly fast. And it is so fast, and the potential is so fast, that the ability to take high-speed shutter speeds on an electronic shutter is much higher than a mechanical shutter. So even if you bought the top of the range DSLR, I don't know, £5,500 worth of camera, the fastest shutter speed you could get is 0.008 of a second. With an electronic shutter, it's 32,000th of a second. Incredibly fast. And it's doing this by scanning one line at a time. Now the problem is that when you scan one line at a time, whilst you can get some very fast speeds, and there's some other advantages like no wear and tear, and you haven't got to worry about shutter count and all that when you're buying a used one, is that it does create problems. And one of the problems is if you're shooting indoors, and this is where I begin to answer Pauline's question, if you're shooting indoors and there's artificial light with fluorescent tubes and some LEDs, the way that they pulse on and off with the AC current interferes with the pulsing of the lines as they go down the sensor, and you can end up with stuff like this. And I'm guessing this is, Pauline, what you got. Please confirm as soon as you hear me ask this question, Pauline. I should point out there is something like a 20-second, 30-second delay between me asking the question and you responding, so I'm just going to wait a few moments, and I'm sure we're going to see an answer in a moment. But you get these lines, and these are interference lines created by an interference between the pulsing lights. Yeah, good, Pauline, this is what she's talking about. The pulsing lights and the pulsing of the scanned sensor by the electronic shutter. Now, the way to beat it is to turn off the electronic shutter, which is really easy. In a Fuji, you can just choose a mechanical shutter, and in most mirrorless cameras, you can switch between between mechanical shutter or an electronic shutter. But that's all you've got to do. Basically, Pauline, is someone said great explanation. Thank you, Sharon. All you've got to do is switch back to mechanical shutter if you're shooting indoors with low light, and you won't get this effect. Now, there are some other strange effects. So, for instance, if I used a mechanical shutter to photograph a really high speed moving subject, and you won't get much faster than this, propellers on an aircraft. Those propellers are spinning around incredibly quickly. But if you shot that with an electronic shutter, what happens is the item that you're photographing is moving so quickly that by the time that scanning on your sensor goes from the top to the bottom, the subject you're photographing may have moved a bit. It isn't in the same place as when the scan started at the top of the sensor, and you get strange effects like this. And that's called rolling shutter. Sometimes if a video has been produced using a camera like uses this kind of technology, as the image pans left to right, say it's moving left to right in a street scene, you might see lampposts bending because the cameras move so quickly left to right, by the time it's moved across and by the time the sensor has been scanned from top to bottom, the lamppost has moved a little bit it's in a different place, so you get bent lampposts. Rolling shutter is a recognised effect. Now, what am I going to say? Yes. So what I'm seeing with Fuji, and I'm guessing with other makes as well, regular updates are coming through, firmware updates, which are helping to reduce, if not completely eliminate, the problem. And I'm sure it won't be very long now before we see this as a fault which no longer exists. It's something which technology is definitely going to beat, but it's still there at the moment. But certainly on my Fujis, I've seen the effect become less and less pronounced. Not so much that, but certainly that's almost negligible now on my my XT3. Really don't see it very much at all. Let's look at the other. So what we're talking about, electronic shutters and mechanical shutters, let's look at some other differences. So the electronic shutter has some really good advantages. One, you can shoot at much faster speeds than mechanical. So I've already said you can shoot at speeds on some cameras up to 32 thousandths of a second, as opposed to 8,000 on a mechanical shutter. Got a question here from Paul. Oh, hang on. So I'm actually going to answer this one. Let me just bring this up. He said, what is your preferred shutter? Do you have both switched on? I programmed one of the programmable buttons on my...
Okay, I found this on the web. What is your preferred shutter? Do you have a switched on? Check it out.
Siri thought I was talking to it. Go away, Siri. Go away. Go. Op it. Every time I do one of these broadcasts, the same thing happens. His question was, what do I prefer and do I have them both switched on? You don't have them on at the same time, you have one or the other. And I programmed one of my programmable buttons so that when I press it, it changes from one to the other. What's my preference? I like the tactile feedback with the sound that comes from a mechanical shutter. I find that satisfying and quite... when I feel it, as I press the button down and you hear that mechanical, feel that mechanical movement, there's something very satisfying about it. So if I had a choice, purely out of using it, I prefer the mechanical. Where do I prefer electronic? If I'm shooting something on a candid basis, so if I'm shooting a wedding, if I can shoot on electronic, I will do, because I can turn the sound off completely. It's completely silent. And the number of times over the years I've shot with a DSLR on a wedding in a big church with loads of echo, and it's one of those quiet moments, you know, when the vicar's doing the vows thing and it's all kind of hush hush, and all you can hear is the cameraman going click 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 click, dead embarrassing. But now with mirrorless cameras, not a sound is uttered. If you're doing street photography, it's fantastic, because if you're clever, people don't know you're photographing them. And if you can turn the sound off by going electronic, they have no idea you've even pressed the button. It's fantastic. So I like both, and it's different shutters for different uses, if that's helpful. Thank you, Paul. So someone said Apple has to get an eye. Oh yeah, I see what you mean with Siri. Thank you, Steve. Steve said Apple just has to get on the act. Oh, for goodness sake, I'm going to get rid of this phone. You see, I said the word Siri and it picked it up. So yes, Apple has to get in on the act. I'm afraid so. Siri is useful at times and annoying at other times. Right, let's go back to this screen. So, would be good for bird photography. Yes, it would. It would. If the bird's not moving, otherwise you might get that rolling shutter effect. But if you're near to the bird and you don't want to make a noise, just going to bring Eileen's thing up on the. Would be good for bird photography then, Eileen says. Yeah, if you're near to the bird. Oh gosh, all asking questions. So Paul's saying, when you say you can't have both, what is the setting? What is the setting? I think that might be a typo there. What is the? Oh, I see. What is the setting for electronic shutter or mechanical? So if you've got a Fuji, which I think you might have, Paul, I'm trying to remember. For those who don't know Paul's on one of my master classes. Yes, you can go into the menu system. It's in under the spanner. It's on. Gosh, can't remember. Just check it through menus. It's there, and you can flick between one and the other. But if you can program it into one of your buttons, it's even better. Right, I won't be answering questions for a second. I need to go through this. So, much faster shutter speeds. No moving parts, which is excellent. Excuse me while I drink my coffee. Nothing to wear out. Usually, if you buy a second-hand camera from one of the major suppliers, one of the things they'll tell you is the shutter count, how many photographs it's been taken. And if it's been used a lot, perhaps by a professional, you'll get a clue by that, and you may not want to buy that. You don't want a mirror that's been activated and slapped, because it really is catapulted up and down under quite a lot of force. If it's been used a lot of times, you may not wish to buy it. A little message there from Beth Johnson. Okay, Beth, catch up on the replay. Next thing. No mechanics means less judder. So if you're shooting a very long exposure, perhaps at night, and maybe for special effects it's, I don't know, several seconds long, when you press the button down on mechanical shutter, even for moderately slow speeds, you could get a little bit of judder from that sort of mechanical action affecting the image, so there's a little bit of jarring. If you were to press the button on a long exposure, where you'd have the camera on the tripod and probably operated by a remote release, if you've got no mechanics going on at all, there's even less opportunity of any kind of image movement caused by a mechanical mirror flipping up and flipping back down again. So it's good from that perspective, and it's silent, which I think is possibly, to me, the greatest advantage. It's completely silent. On a Fuji, you can actually choose silent or 2 or 3 different levels of volume to suit your own taste, and you can even choose different sounds of different types of shutters to suit your own particular taste. The disadvantage is that rolling shutter. When you're photographing something moving incredibly fast, you may get image distortion. Here's a weird one. At shutter speeds over 1,000th of a second, your bokeh is reduced. The background blur isn't as blurry. You see more of the detail in the background. So I saw a video of this a few months back now, and I haven't seen an explanation for it. I really ought to check this up to see whether anyone's got any ideas why this might be the case. So if you're looking to take a shot where you want a really good, creamy, super smooth, buttery blur in the background behind, maybe you're photographing a beautiful lady or a child and you just want a really soft background, once you go over 1,000th of a second in electronic shutter, you don't get such a smooth bokeh. Weird one. And then the possibility of banding, which is why Pauline asked the original question. Here's a biggie though. This is a real biggie. Flash doesn't work with electronic shutters. If you try and take a flash photograph with electronic shutters, a button won't operate. Nothing, your picture won't be taken. And I guess that's because with the exposure happens line by line by line, at what point does the flash go off? I don't really know the answer to this one. I've heard that as an explanation, but it doesn't make sense to me. Anyway, if you want to shoot with flash, you have to use mechanical. I hope that's helpful to you. Let's come back and show my face. If I can find the right thing to click on. Can't. Let's try that. Oh dear. Let's try that. Here we go. Boom. Lovely. Okay. So I hope that was helpful. Pauline, that should inform you now what to do if you're indoors. Go over to the mechanical shutter. If you want to use flash, use the mechanical shutter. If you want to shoot secretly, surreptitiously in the background without people knowing or without disturbing people, go electronic. Good. Lovely. Any other questions about that before I move on to the second question? I'm just looking through all the comments down here, so just bear with me, guys. I'm just going to put this one up. Tracy, she's here late. Wine. That's only because on a couple of these back I was drinking whiskey while I was doing this. I think I've had a beer possibly as well. But I only got coffee tonight. Here we go. Keep calm. I'm a photographer. And it's actually cold coffee by now. That's because I went indoors to get a crunchy. I do like my crunches. And it sat around for a bit too long. Right, and I'm just going to again try and sort this image out because it's breaking up a little bit. It's quite annoying. There we go. Good. Let's go on to the question now by Giselle, who I don't think's here. She said she was going to be away. She says her question is about extension tubes. Now, if you don't know what they are, I'll explain in a second. Thanks, Pauline. Do ISO settings affect the banding, Steve? Not to my knowledge. It's all to do with the frequency of the scanning of the sensor getting conflicting with the frequency of the pulsing of the light in certain types of lights. Basically, ISO is just basically increasing the artificially magnifying the image. Magnifying the brightness of the image. It's amplifying the signal, so it shouldn't make any difference, but I'm happy to be proved wrong. I've not come across that before. Right, Giselle's questions about extension tubes. Here are 3 extension tubes, and she says, what's my advice on extension tubes to get good focus as depth of field is so narrow, and would that be the same on a dedicated macro lens? She's looking at buying one for her Olympus. If you've not done macro photography, which is photographing things super close up like insects and flowers and so on, you may not even know what extension tubes are. And here's a macro lens. Okay, this is a Canon macro lens. This is the 100mm f2 with image stabilization, f2.8, beg your pardon. And this is a bit of a workhorse for many macro photographers. So if you do want to photograph bugs and plants and insects and flowers and all that kind of stuff, this is a great lens to start with. When I do the masterclass, we look at 3 different types of macro lenses and all kinds of other amazing goodies. I actually think the macro class is the best of the lot. Had some amazing reactions when we did some crazy insect shots. But this lens is a very high definition lens and will enable you to get super close. However, how can I start this off? What happens if you want to increase the magnification of the thing you're photographing or get even closer? And in fact, the way you increase your magnification is by getting closer. The way you increase the magnification of a lens like this, which is magnifying 1:1, let me explain what I mean by 1:1. What's considered a macro lens? A macro lens is any lens which magnifies something on a basis of 1:1. So, if you had a coin let's say the coin was 1 inch diameter. So there will be people who don't know inches, they're only dealing in centimetres. Sorry, I deal in inches. If you had a 1 inch coin and you moved it as close as you could to that lens at its minimum focus distance and it's pin sharp, that 1 inch coin will appear as a 1 inch image, a size of 1 inch on the sensor. In other words, whatever you photograph in front of the lens appears that exact same size on the sensor. That's 1-to-1 magnification. Most macro lenses are 1-to-1. There's a couple which go bigger than that, but not many, and some go less than that. In fact, most of them go less than that, but a proper macro lens is 1-to-1 or more. What happens if you want to go more than 1-to-1? Well, an extension tube, and I'll show you them again in a second, they're called extension tubes because they extend the distance between the lens and the camera. And the further that distance is, the closer you can get to your subject and the greater the magnification. Let me just take these apart. So there's 3 here all joined together. And they come in different sizes. So that size, which is a what? That's a 12mm. Then I've got a 20mm, which are bolting together. And then I've got a 36mm. Now you can use them individually, and the bigger they are, the closer you get to the subject and the bigger the magnification. Or you can join them together in groups or all together. And if you put the whole of these, in fact I'll do that. Massively extending the lens, but the lens actually doesn't start to here. All of that is extension tubes. So you've actually increased the ability of this lens to get closer to the subject by that amount. Therefore you can get a closer image. And they're very inexpensive unless you buy own brand. If you buy Canon's own ones, you'll be spending hundreds. If you buy Kenko, which you can get on Amazon, in fact, I don't know anyone who shoots macro who uses own brand. They all use Kenko. I've used Kenko for years. 100 quid, maybe 125 these days for the whole lot, all 3. And you don't want to go super cheap, because if you go super cheap, you won't get these little contacts. Can you see those little contacts on there? They transmit. They allow the camera to communicate with the lens that's bolted on the other end. They give you full rights for autofocus and the aperture and so on. You need that electronic circuitry. If you buy really cheap, that's not on there. So you lose the autofocus. Not that you want to use that for macro anyway. You should be shooting in manual focus. And you lose control of the aperture. So without those, everything's stuck at maximum aperture, f2.8 or whatever your lens is, which means you haven't got any control over the depth of field, which you need by having. I use Kenko ones. Brilliant. Well done, Paul. Good. So that's what they do. They take you closer. Now, you don't actually need to put them on a macro lens. You could put these on a 50mm lens. I've put them on a 135 lens and got some really great shots. But the longer the focal length, the crazier the depth of field. So sticking these on my 135 f2 lens, the depth of field was just nuts. Absolutely nuts thin. Put them on a 50mm, it'll be a lot better. In fact, there are 50mm macro lenses which have a wider depth of field. The longer the lens, the narrower your depth of field. But there are advantages. If you got, I've got a 180mm macro lens in the cupboard, and that means I can shoot butterflies and bees landing on things from further away. I've got less chance of disturbing them. With this one, I do need to get reasonably close, and the chances are, to get the shot I want, I'd probably frighten off the insect. But with a longer lens, you can take the picture from further away and less chance of them being frightened off. Anyway, her question was, what's my advice on extension tubes to get good focus as depth of field is so narrow, and would that be the same on a dedicated macro lens? So what she's thinking about is whether she just buys tubes and puts them on her other lenses, or whether she buys a dedicated lens. Depends what lens you put them on, Giselle. If you put it on a longer lens, the depth of field is going to get nuts. Depth of field will always be really, really narrow with macro, because one of the laws of physics is the closer you get to something, the narrower your depth of field. Think about it when you're photographing, say you're photographing your kids or your wife or your husband. And if you have a lens which has a very wide aperture, which would give you a lovely narrow depth of field and a lovely blurred out background, if you stand a long way back from them trying to do head to toe, actually not a lot of the background gets blurred, but the closer you get to them, in fact if you want to just do a headshot, the background is really blurred out a lot, because the closer you get, the narrower your depth of field. Eileen says she's got a 105 and a 300 macro. Yeah, well, I suspect the 300 macro would that be on a zoom with a macro setting, Eileen? The closer you get, the longer the lens, all these things narrow your depth of field. Still trying to answer the question. The question is, what's better for her, to put a cheap set of these on one of her existing lenses, or to buy a macro lens? And it depends on the lens you're putting them on. If you put them on a longer lens, the depth of field is going to get really crazy. When you're photographing insects and flowers, there's a few tricks you can use to make your life easier. For instance, imagine photographing an insect, and what you should be getting in focus first are its eyes. It's like when you're photographing people or pets, it's a 70 to 300 macro setting. Okay, Eileen, so that would class as a zoom lens with a close focus setting. They call it macro as a selling tool, but it's not genuine macro. It doesn't magnify as much as proper macro. And I don't think we've got time to go into that in any great depth today. You just have to trust me, it's not true macro, and it won't get you as close as a proper macro lens, or even an ordinary 50mm lens with one of these on. Right, still trying to answer a question. What should she do? Should she buy a set of these, or should she buy a macro lens? I would say buy these first, because they're cheap. And if you really enjoy macro, then go to the expense of buying a proper macro lens. And then, of course, you can use these with a macro lens and go crazy. So if you put these on this is only roughly, if you put this set on this lens, remember this magnifies 1:1, this effectively is close as doubles the magnification of that. So, Giselle, I would get these first. Put them on your lenses. Have a lot of fun. I've gone out of focus. I'll come back in. And the camera hasn't even been drinking all evening. It's crazy. Go for these first. It's a cheap option. You do lose a little bit of light when you use macro extension tubes, but not a great deal. Use these first, save some money, experiment. If you enjoy macro photography, then buy yourself one of these, and then you can use that on its own, or with any of these, or all three, or just two of them, and you've got maximum flex ability. The bigger the magnification, the more the light loss. So Colin was kind of right. I don't know if you saw the message just popped up. He was saying that you lose. Let's put this into perspective. I've got a very specialised macro lens in the cupboard which will magnify up to 5 times, and not just once or even twice, but 5 times normal size. It's the one that really gives you those big bug-eyed insect shots, we can see the eyes. Here's the thing, it's an f2.8 lens, but at 5 times magnification, the law of physics just goes through the roof. if I were to shoot with that particular lens at 5 times magnification, that f2.8 becomes f99. f99. That is crazy. And I've had to shoot insects outside in bright sunshine with flash because there wasn't enough light. There was not enough light in bright sunshine to get the shot I wanted. So I had 2 flashes on it. But that's a different story. What's the best option for Giselle in terms of getting good depth of field? Also, if you can find a couple bellows, that's a better option than tube. Never use bellows. Can't comment, Colin. Can't help you on that one. When you're photographing an insect, and you're trying to get the eyes in focus, if you've got the angle wrong, you'll get the eyes sharp, but the rest of the body goes blurred. So what you have to do, if that's the insect, you kind of have to move your camera around so you're parallel with it, so that the head and the body or the wings are all the same distance from the lens. As soon as you do that, only one part of the body is close to you and the rest of it's away. So if you were to focus on the closest bit, the latter part will go soft. If you can move around so that you're perpendicular to the body and the head, then you can get nearly everything sharp, but you'll never get an entire insect sharp, not completely, with really, really high close-ups. Simon says, in macro photography, I presume ISO is set as low as possible for detail, so need to be in a tripod. That's how I work, but it isn't how a lot of other macro photographers work. I like to have the best possible detail. Because sensors are so good these days, many argue that you can shoot a 400, 800 ISO with no problem, and it's passable. I don't like that, but other people do, and I'm not saying who's right, who's wrong. That's personal preference. If you're not sure, try it at the higher ISOs and see what your images look like. And if you like the way they come out, stay with that. You know, there's no right and wrong on this one. I like to shoot all my detail work at the lowest possible ISO. And it means if I have to do any work in post, I've got the best image to start with. Some of you will say, you don't do work in post, do you, on macro? I do it on anything. Julie said, Giselle, I have both the Olympus macro lenses, 30 and a 60. If you want any info on them, the 30 is on offer, 169 quid at the moment. Gosh, that's amazing. Thank you, Julie, for that. That's really excellent. Okay, so if you want the insect, as much as the insect as sharp as possible, try and take the shot perpendicular to the head and the body and the wings, so you've got as much of it in the same plane of focus. You don't want one part of it closer than the other. Sometimes it's just impossible, you can't do it, but that's in an ideal world. Failing that, then if you want everything sharp, you have to move into stacking, really, which is taking multiple images, focusing on the insect at different points. The insect needs to be still, so you focus on the nearest point, then you focus a little bit further on, and you focus again, taking a shot each time until you get from one end of the insect to the other, and then you combine all the images together on the computer to produce a single image, which results in the whole insect being sharp. That's something we really can't do on a session like this, but we do it on a masterclass. It's really cool. Not that we can meet a masterclass because of the coronavirus, but certainly masterclass 2 are halfway through the year. We'll be doing it fairly soon after we restart. Masterclass 3, you'll definitely be doing it. And I have people booked onto Masterclass 4, which was due to start in September, but whether it will now or not, I'm not optimistic. Okay, so we have been running just under 45 minutes. I've got about 3 or 4 minutes left. Any other questions? Any questions at all about what we've been discussing or anything completely different? Who wants a sneak preview of something exciting? Let me just show you something. What I've been working on. I'm going to bring this over to the other side of the screen. Was that a question? Stacking used a lot in astrophotography, yes, and stacking is also used in landscape photography. If you're taking a picture of a landscape and you want high definition image, I don't know what the capital of Peru is. Bogota? I don't know. Paris? What was I talking about? Oh my, look, all these interruptions. No, I don't know. Who cares? Anyway, so you most of you will know that we've got this academy, HSP Academy, being designed at the moment, and I was working on where am I was working on today with Matt, the web designer, and what I'm going to show you now is what I think the front page may look like. We've had a beta test group trying it out in its very basic form, learned a lot from it, but this is where we are at the moment. Let's click on this and hopefully you should see it. So this is where we are at the moment. There's going to be groups of portrait, landscape, flash, wildlife and macro, street photography and editing. There's going to be a regular, like a charty of the most liked and the best loved images on a weekly or monthly basis, and a whole bunch of things. So there you are the first to see it. Matt hasn't seen this yet, so he might say we can't do that, but that's what we're trying for. Let's go back. Okay, so we're just coming to the end of the 45 minutes. Any other questions before I go? Let me just scroll to the bottom of my word, look at that lot. Jeez. I was talking about stacking being used in landscape. Imagine you're taking a picture of a landscape scene. You want to shoot it at the lens's sweet spot, which is where it gives its greatest definition. That may not give you a wide enough depth of field to get the whole scene in shot, so you might take it using 2 or 3 or 4 different stack shots, focusing on different parts of the scenery and then joining them together in post-production. Okay. Before you go, filters for landscape. Oh, well done, Chris. Bugger. I thought I escaped. I can't give you a thorough answer on this one. What should you have? A landscape photographer who hasn't got a polarizing filter isn't a landscape photographer. A polarizing filter reduces reflection, so it's great for photographing water because you can quite often see beneath the water. It's great for photographing windows because you can see through the windows, but it has a lovely effect on colours and makes them more vivid, and blue skies are just incredible. However, they used to be better in the days of film. Once they went to digital, because of the way that the sensors are scanned in lines, the old style polarizing filters wouldn't work with them, so they now make circular polarizers. And this means that that lovely rich blue sky only works when the sun's at 90 degrees to you. So if I'm looking at you now, I can take a picture using it with the sun over there or over there or there, but not in front of me, not behind me. If I try and take a picture with the sun in front of me or behind me, nothing changes. The sky looks the same. As I go left or right, it looks amazing. If you go somewhere in between, you might get part of the sky blue and powerful and dark and amazing, and then the other bit gone back to normal. So you just got to pick the angle. See, Colin says he disagrees, says he hasn't got a polarizing filter. Colin, you are not a proper landscape photographer. At that point, I'm disappearing. I think you'll find that it is probably the most universally used of all filters, but no one says you have to use it. No one says you have to. The other most commonly used ones are graduated filters, which enable you to put a different exposure into the sky to the foreground, so that you get the detail of the clouds brought out. So you'd want a graduated neutral density filter, and they come in different levels of exposure. So, one might only reduce the light in the skies by a stop, or 2 stops, or 3 stops, and so on. One of the other ones that's most popular is very deep, dense, black, non-graduated neutral density filters. Some of them which stop maybe 3 stops of light completely going into your camera, or 6 stops of light. 10 stops of light is quite popular. 15 and 20 stops are now available, I understand, and they stop the light coming in so much that your camera is forced to shoot for very long exposures, and that's how you get those soft wispy seas, where it looks steamy, because the camera's been open for such a long time. The water's moved during the shot and it's just kind of gone a bit misty, very ethereal. So that's a neutral density filter, usually just referred to as an ND filter. Neutral density, because in theory they're a dense grey without imparting any kind of colour into the shot, so they're neutral. From what I understand, most of them do impart some kind of colour actually, but not a problem because we can fix everything in Lightroom. Coloured filters for mono, yes. Well, if you've got a Fuji, of course, you can add those filters on by flicking a button. And if you shoot in black and white on a digital camera, on a mirrorless camera, you can create the effect as if you'd put coloured gels on in front of the camera back in the days of film. Back in the days of film, you shoot in black and white film. If you want the sky to look really ominous, you put a red filter on and it makes the blue really dark. It looks really stormy and like it's the end of the world. It looks like Armageddon, and you can do that in a Fuji. Don't know other cameras do that. And I think I'm going to leave it there. I hope that's answered some of your questions, Chris. If you've got a particular query, please email me at info@gohsp.com and I'll see whether I can help. That's it for tonight. Have a good evening. See you in a week's time. Night, guys.